Australia has been profoundly shaped by its British imperial inheritance. Over the next 13 programs, we'll examine that inheritance, the sights, sounds, language and politics of empire.
All I ask you to remember in this country of yours is that every man, woman and child who even sees you with a passing glimpse as you go by will remember it. Remember it with joy. Remember it in the words of the old 17th century poet who wrote those famous words, "I did but see her passing by, and yet I love her till I die."
The series begins around the turn of the century with the Boer War in South Africa and with the Australian colonies on the verge of federation. It ends in the 1990s, with Australians looking towards the centenary of federation in 2001. The monarchy appears to be in crisis, and to the rising generation of Australians, the language and sentiment of empire appears as quaint as the faded advertisements of the Empire Cocoa Girl. Where has she gone? What did it all mean? What do the symbols of empire mean today?
The Queen has done a wonderful job. I think royalty, monarchy is archaic in this day and age.
I believe in royalty. I mean, I fought for the country last time the war was on, and I think it should stay that way. You know, well, there's a generation of us that fought. I mean, in years to come, perhaps, when there's no more soldiers left, well, it may be different then.
It's good to have a figurehead or something for the British. Like, they're very proud of their heritage and things like that, so good for them, but maybe not good for Australia.
The way things are with the monarchy, I mean, there's a lot of history there. You know, as my father says, it was good enough for the last 200 years. I mean, I think I think apart from anything else, all the argument about it, there's far greater problems going on at the moment.
I don't see that Australia needs a queen. I don't know that any country needs a royalty, although the dumber the royalty, the safer the country.
The impact of British influence on Australian life is far-reaching. In law, religion, politics, education, the arts, sport, and diet, Britain provided powerful precedents and influential models. There were, of course, critics of British imperial influence, but even they acknowledged the power and centrality of Britain. Generations of Australian schoolchildren grew up in a world in which the prestige of the British Empire was a centerpiece of their curriculum. They were instructed in the meaning of the monarchy and the flag, immersed in the songs of empire, and taught the words, "I love my country, the British Empire. I honor her king, King George V. I salute her flag, the Union Jack. I promise faithfully to obey her laws." In a world of empires, Australian children were encouraged to view the British Empire as the largest and fairest of them all, an empire which put justice and fair play first. The advance of the British Empire meant the advance of civilization. The story of the British Empire was presented as a mighty, world-embracing movement, an heroic mix of noble deeds and thrilling adventure. To re-enter that world now requires imaginative effort. Today we're struck by our distance from the language and sentiment of empire.
A nation mourns, and with deep sincerity, even as it goes about its daily tasks. No pomp, no panoply, for this is the new world. But the king lived here too, deep in the hearts of his people. In cities, towns, and hamlets, suddenly hushed and somber, Australians pay their last tribute to a beloved man. He was a man of faith. His family life was an inspiration to all men. And so his subjects, whatever their faith, go to pray. The king is dead, but his memory is immortal. The throne of England, which is indeed the throne of all the Commonwealth nations, is never vacant. The king is dead, long live the queen. And so today, for the first time in more than 100 years, a new queen is hailed. Elizabeth II, in her 26th year, the mother of children, sits upon the mightiest and most enduring throne in the world. In our youth lies the destiny of the world of the future. Tens of millions of children throughout the British Commonwealth sorrow at the passing of a well-loved king, and rejoice in the accession of a young and beautiful girl who from this day forth shall be their queen. In a school near Sydney, a simple, touching ceremony symbolizes their faith and their love. With Elizabeth, they well may live on into the 21st century, which we but glimpse along the misty corridors of time. May it be a better, cleaner world. God bless Elizabeth. Long may she reign.
Inevitably, opinion will differ over how much British influence has benefited us or inhibited our development as an independent nation.
We are in a great stream, and the stream has reached to the four corners of the world, and we are an important part of it. The legal system of Australia is fundamentally grounded, as is that of a quarter of humanity, upon the law as it was designed and made by judges in the Royal Courts of Justice and in Westminster Hall in England. And that, in a sense, is one of the great gifts of the British, of the English specifically, to the world. They brought their language, they brought their notions of fair play, which exhibit themselves in Parliament and in the courts. They brought their notions, ultimately, of freedom, which was destructive of their empire. They brought their ideas of commerce and of sport and of habits such as cups of tea, and they brought their law. And their law is one of their abiding legacies, and we are the inheritors of it in Australia. Now, of course, since our own responsible government, we've made our own laws, and that's a long time now, 1856 in New South Wales. And we've made many more laws since the colonies of Australia became the states at federation and the federal Commonwealth was established.
For some decades, Australia's formal links with Britain have been in decline. Japan and the US are now our major trading partners, although neither is ever likely to have the dominance Britain once held. More Australians than ever before are questioning the relevance of Australia retaining its links with the British monarchy.
I have Dutch heritage, and the monarchy doesn't represent very much for me. I think we can have a system of government that doesn't depend on those antecedents. Just doesn't seem relevant anymore.
There's nothing wrong with still keeping a Commonwealth head, as like Canada did. They're their own people, but they still look to the Queen to be that head.
I don't know. I think Australia's good in the Commonwealth. I think we need the support of the Queen, and I'd hate to think that if we became a republic that we would need a visa to get into England, and I think there's a lot of people in Australia who are, you know, sort of English background,
Yep.
and yeah, your English background, and I just tend to think that, you know, we're better off the way we are.
What do I think of the Queen? I think she serves a great function for the English people, the British people, but I don't think she's appropriate for our nation anymore.
I think the royal family is a big rort, so thanks very much.
The study of Australian relationships with the British Empire gets to the heart of a lot of our debate of the moment. Where is our culture to be centred? What are the crucial issues when we look to the future? Which of the regions do we belong in? How independent, in fact, can we be as a middle-sized but small-scale population living in this region of the world? Those were the kinds of issues in a different form which were being debated in the 1890s or at the turn of the century. For those whose imperial nationalism at the turn of the century was looking to a restructured relationship with Great Britain, there was absolutely no doubt that the focus of the empire was the crown, and embodied in the crown were traditions of liberty and security for all citizens. To be a subject of the crown was to give an individual a particular place in a very special civilization in the history of the world.
In one sense, for lots of Australians, there was just one loyalty. That was loyalty to Britain. And Australian interests and Australian honour were achieved only through service to Britain. They protected us, we became big because we were related to them, and that was all that mattered. To other Australians, there was a kind of ambiguous dual loyalty. That expression was sometimes used at the time, in which in the small field were Australians, in the big field were British.
The link to empire and to Britain was a sense that we were cut off from the rest of the world, isolated. You remember the tyranny of distance. Britain was not only the source of a significant part of our population, but it was the protector. It would look after us and it would buy our products. It was a protector in both those senses. So there was a strong kind of sense that we had to stay linked to the motherland for our culture, for our identity, for all the valuable things and the good things that will help us survive. There was a very strong sense that we couldn't do it on our own at that point, for some segments, not for everybody, obviously.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, Mr. Speaker, members of the House of Representatives.
If we want to change our system of government, because that really is what is involved, constitutional monarchy works because we have an accidentally hereditary sovereign who is non-political and who has representatives who are non-political and should be non-political and shock us when they are not completely non-political. And we have judges who are, or strive to be, and should try to be, non-political. These are very British ideas, and they are rather unusual ideas. They are ideas that lead to a more temperate society, which is a society more tolerant, I think, of different points of view.
From the 1880s, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the Australian colonies needed coordinated policies, particularly on matters of defence, immigration, and their economies. It was foolish for the colonies to go on acting independently of each other, as had happened with the relatively simple business of deciding railway gauges. Henry Parkes of New South Wales and Alfred Deakin of Victoria were among the most prominent federationists. The details of federation were thrashed out in a series of federal conventions, but the intricate politics and constitutional complexities of the movement ensured that federation did not excite popular enthusiasm. Even so, a majority of electors in all colonies eventually voted in favour of a draft constitution. In 1900, the Imperial Parliament enacted the Constitution Bill. On January the 1st, 1901, the Australian colonies formally federated. Australia became a Commonwealth. From 1901, Australia's links to the Crown were represented in the role and person of the Governor-General. Each state continued to have a governor appointed by the Crown. Federation was celebrated as an imperial event. Australia was a new nation on the world stage, but closely linked to and dependent on Britain. Its 4 million white citizens formed a self-conscious outpost of empire. They prided themselves on being 98% British and moved quickly in their new Commonwealth Parliament to establish Australia as a continent reserved for people of British stock. The so-called native population was generally viewed as an ancient and dying race.
In 1900, Australians were living in a world of empires. If you're at school and you opened your school atlas and you looked at your world, you would have seen large parts of it coloured in red. And in fact, in the geography lessons, they sometimes gave you an extra little crayon so that you could fill in those parts of the world which were red, because they were so expansive. But the rest of the map was also showing large areas of greens and blues, striped spots, all representing about half a dozen major empires, which were legacies of the expansion of Europe from the time of Columbus onwards. Quite as extensive as the British Empire, in fact, in spatial terms, perhaps even bigger, was the French Empire, which had been created from an age of mercantile expansion, but very largely created from the late 1890s, at the end of the century, as a great rival to the British in Africa, in Asia, and parts of the Pacific. And then there were newcomers to the imperial map. The Germans had suddenly broken out of their isolation of Northern Europe with Bismarck's expansions from 1884 onwards, and large parts of Africa and parts of the Pacific were now marked out in Prussian blue. And then there were older empires that represented the expansion of the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, all signs of what was an extraordinary era in the history of the world. Beyond the formal empires which you could look at in a school textbook, there was the beginning of the rise of another giant of a power in the United States. And America was pressing its influence and its trade outwards across the Pacific. So, in a sense, the maps were also misleading. They didn't fully recognize the fact that you had now a new superpower beginning to emerge in global politics.
The British Empire was most particularly a maritime enterprise, and it has the additional unique characteristic of having produced really very large European states abroad, which not even the French quite managed to do. The Spaniards had, of course, in earlier years produced something like it, but not really on the scale and the solidity that seemed to exist for the British Empire at the end of the 19th century.
I think it's also important to grasp that while the British looked all-powerful on that map, and people talked about a Pax Britannica which ruled the world, an empire in which the sun never set, in fact it was an empire in which the problems rarely set. And these were of two kinds. Partly they were problems which were incipient of the very nature of the British Empire, that it was so diverse, it was so extensive. There were constant problems at the local end, challenges to its authority, the breakdown of authority, rebellions, small wars, as Victoria spoke of them, a whole series of the beginnings, really, of colonial nationalisms or indigenous revolts. They were part of that empire. The more it expanded, the more, in a sense, it met challenge from the local environment. But beyond those internal challenges, there were also a series of extraordinarily important external challenges to the British Empire, which lay in the rise of the new imperialism of the French, the Germans, and the determination of the Americans to have their place in the sun.
Federation offered an unspectacular transition to nationhood, despite bunting, speeches, pageantry, and display. Australia had federated peacefully, at the stroke of a pen, without any war of independence. Britain had no reason to oppose federation.
As far as the British government was concerned, and one wonders whether the British public had much view on the subject at all, but as far as the British government was concerned, the advantage, if it can be called that, of an Australian federation was that it could strengthen the Australian colonies rather as British North American Confederation had strengthened those provinces under the name of the Dominion of Canada in the late 1860s. It could strengthen them, it would relieve the government this much more of responsibility for, say, the defence of the colonies. It wouldn't relieve them entirely by any means, but somewhat more. It was thought of in terms of defence very largely. It was also thought of in terms of customs tariffs, rationalising things which would perhaps, and in the mind especially of Joseph Chamberlain, the Secretary of State for the Colonies in the second half of the 90s, in his mind, this kind of thing was a very significant contribution to the possibility of an imperial customs union, possibly even an imperial federation of some kind. If you federate the colonies first, then you might be able to federate them with the mother country.
and so on. This was going a bit far, I might say. He didn't have a hope in hell of getting this far, but he was a very considerable enthusiast about, well, what other people were enthusiastic about, and that was imperial unity.
Perhaps the most characteristic phrase of the turn of the century was Alfred Deacon's idea of Australians as independent Australian Britons, that captured both the sense of colonial assertiveness and the emergence of new Australian interests, and pointed to the idea of a new Australian nation, and yet saw it very much within a restructured relationship with the British. And I suppose behind the more formal relationship, which is there through the Governor-General, which is there in the economic relationships, was a cultural question. How people actually saw themselves, how in their innermost being they thought of themselves on that world map that we talked about earlier. For many, it was impossible to think that they were other than Britishers who were living in what was a Greater Britain. And their nationalism was the determination to take the strengths of British civilization as they saw it and to transform it in a new land to create a new society.
I think that Australians had been thinking themselves as Australian for decades before federation in a kind of overall social sense, but they also thought of themselves, of course, above all, as being British. Now, it was known, people were taught at school, I remember looking through some of the school syllabuses, that Australians had this enormous benefit of being Australians in the small world and British on the large world. And chauvinism, whatever you might want to call it in Australia, principally consisted in being British. It was through being British that we were better than anybody else in the world, and it was through being British that we were part of a dominant race, as they used to say in those days. Being Australian was a kind of optional extra, important to some, loathsome to some.
Did membership of the British Empire confer a significance upon Australians that they could not hope to achieve on their own? Or did it inhibit the development of independent political thought and action? Were we enlarged by our links with Britain or diminished by them?
If you ask the question, when did Australia become an independent nation-state, it's very hard to give a definite date. Was it in 1901 when the colonies federated? But on the other hand, at that point, the British Prime Minister dealing with the British head of state through the Governor-General? Is it Gallipoli? Some people see that as a symbolic birth of the nation. Is it in 1931 with the Statute of Westminster? Now, that's not a date that's going to arouse any strong national feeling. Is it when Curtin says reluctantly we have to turn to look in the Second World War, we have to turn to the United States as an ally in the Second World War? Is it in 1975 when people finally have a good hard look at the Australian political institutions and see that the conventions of the Westminster system that they'd thought were the basis of their political system were not? I mean, when exactly would you point to? And I think that shows the problem for Australian nationalism, that the Australian nation-state emerges out of the colonial dependent relationship with Britain, and it's a very slow process, and there's no one date that can be celebrated, like, say, in America with the War of Independence, as the beginning of our nationhood.
I think as a historian, you can say one of the things we can point to is phases in public temper and attitude. And you could well see around the turn of this century in the 1890s, you could see a changing series of responses and attitudes to the British Empire. You can see a series of responses which are as a result of the two great wars, where the relationship was again adjusted. You can see a changing perspective that really comes after the massive wave of European migration after the Second World War. That changes the nature of the relationship. And I think since the 1960s and 70s, with the development of, through the Cold War and now the new international order, I think again you can see necessarily changes in attitudes to both the old imperial connection, but also to the question of, should we always live with a big and powerful friend?
For many Australians, being Australian is not quite enough. That Australia is a small, relatively powerless country. And I think being a part of the British Empire gave them a sense of being part of something that was much more significant and powerful than Australia will ever be. And I think there is, in some ways, a loss in that for Australians. When you look at somebody like Sir Robert Menzies, it wasn't that he was not aware, if you like, of the changing of the relations between Britain and Australia, but he felt he desperately wanted Australia to stay part of a British Empire, and after that as a British Commonwealth, because that made it part of something that was much bigger and hence more significant than Australia on its own could ever provide.
While Australia's relations with Britain have changed, the reverse is also true. Britain's entry into the European community signalled a permanent change of direction and a new trading order. Australian products were no longer privileged in Britain. From 1964, Australians travelled on Australian instead of British passports. Getting work permits in the motherland was more difficult, removing more of the sentimental ties to Britain.
Should Australia become a republic? I don't think so.
Probably. Yes. Might take a little while, but I think the royal family have had their period of time, and we should be able to stand on our own. We're too far away.
My husband's 12 years in the Navy, and no, we both believe in what we've got now.
Why? Because I think Australia should have its own heritage, its own identity, and its own direction, really, as opposed to following the English model.
I don't see any point. I think we've come a long way, the way we are now. I just don't see any point to make a change like that.
So what do you see as the place of the Queen?
Oh, I don't know.
In the aftermath of the Second World War, the tide turned against the spirit of the empire. As the pace of decolonisation quickened, imperial values lost their relevance and their command of the high moral ground. India, with the largest population of the empire, became an independent member of the Commonwealth in 1947. Gestures which once seemed noble embodiments of empire appeared bloodthirsty, mercenary, or, perhaps more damaging, merely laughable. The empire became the target of satire. The ripping yarns of imperial storytellers came under closer scrutiny. The world has seen many empires come and go. Has the British Empire succeeded and endured where others have not? Have other imperial powers displaced Britain? In which direction are Australians looking today?
I think, the royalty's gone down with all the scandal and everything, and maybe it won't last forever.
We're a nation on our own, so I think we should stand on our own 2 feet and sort of get rid of her.
I don't know what a republic is.
Do you know?
Yes, it should be. No, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't become a republic.
Why not?
Because I think it's good that we have the Queen in charge, so I just think we shouldn't become a republic.
Yeah, we should, because it's our own country, and we should have more freedom.
Yeah.
Instead of always, being with the Queen. We should change the flag as well.